My name is Bob Datilio. I'm here in the library of Howard Zinn, one of our best-known radical historians. We're going to expand on some of the themes and issues that Howard brought up several months ago in his public lecture at the Dante Alighieri Society of Cambridge. His talk, The Meaning of Sacco and Vanzetti, was presented to a full auditorium of some 250 people. Howard, you began by saying how amazed you were about the power of the case to keep attracting audiences, many of them who were quite young and for whom the beginning of the case, now almost some 90 years ago, deals with events that are no longer familiar. Can you help us try to explain this? You speak to many young people, and perhaps you can tell us something about the nature of this attraction.
Well, I think everybody's attracted to crime stories. Whether the crime has been committed or not, people are attracted to stories that end up in courtrooms and trials. And I think young people especially. And courtrooms are dramatic places. They're more dramatic than theaters. The things that happen in courtrooms are fascinating. So aside from the political content of the case, just the drama of the Sacco and Vanzetti case, I think, is something that has always appealed to anybody who heard about it. And of course, as soon as anybody even begins to learn something about the case of Sacco and Vanzetti, it's immediately a fascinating story. Well, if you think of the context of it, and think of that time, the time of the end of World War I, the beginning of the Roaring '20s, and you think of these two amazing figures of Sacco and Vanzetti, and then you think of the clamor that was aroused all over the country and all over the world by that case. So I think it's something that has a natural attraction for people, and I think the whole issue of guilt, innocence, the role of politics in the judicial system, the question of whether there is justice in the American system, the issue of immigrants, of radicals, and all of those things, I think, mingle to create an absolutely sort of brilliant setting for a human drama, and that's what interests people.
Well, the Sacco Vanzetti case contains all of these elements, and at the same time, very peculiar for a case. It probably has more words and attention that have been formally paid to it, every single aspect, immigration, law, crime, politics, than almost any other event in the 20th century, certainly one of the leading events of the 20th century. But this means that the case, perhaps your interpretation of it depends upon the perspective that a person or an audience or a public brings to it. I mean, one would be the more general public might be interested by some of the elements that you're talking about, the detective story aspect of it. Some of the lawyers, legal types, are interested in how law was administered. Then there's another issue which actually did lead to the end of the death penalty in the United States, the issue of execution as a means of the state enforcing its law. But for instance, do you make a different kind of talk if it's for a radical group or for a general public group? I mean, do you emphasize certain parts of the case in a different manner? Or do you just speak the same to everyone? That's impossible for a human.
Well, that's an interesting question. Do I deliberately change what I say about the case depending on the audience? I don't think so. It might be, depending on the audience, that I would emphasize certain aspects of the case and not others. It might be that if I'm speaking to an audience that I think is well informed about the case, I don't have to give them as much of the factual material, and I could merely talk about the interpretation and meaning of the case, but not only with the Sacco and Vanzetti case, but with other things that I talk about in history. I certainly don't change my point of view.
No,
but I might change the style with which I speak. I may change which parts of the story I emphasize. I suppose if I were talking to a class in constitutional law or talking to, let's say, police officers, I might emphasize different parts of the case. But I probably, in general, my approach would be the same. My emphasis would be the same. Certainly, my point of view would be the same.
Well, have you been following some of the recent literature that has come out dealing with the case?
Not as much as you, Bob. Nobody follows the literature as much as you do.
Well,
but are you talking about the whole question of the guilt and innocence?
Well, that has almost been changed. At one time, that was the big question.
Yes.
Did they do it or didn't they?
Yes.
As a matter of fact, one of the old anarchists who, when he had left, he had been involved with the defense committee and gone back to Italy. And when he was in Rome, he met Malatesta. And he said the first question that Malatesta asked him was, did they do it or didn't they? He had to know how he was going to defend them. So, I mean, that, without question, as you talked about before, is the detective story, interest in it. But at the same time, some of these books now, first of all, their titles, I think, will explain it. One was called Buddha's Wagon. Now, Mario Buddha is a figure that figures. It was at his house that the police chief first went to try to arrest some of the people suspected for the South Braintree trial. When they couldn't catch Buddha, Sacco and Vanzetti were with Buddha. And it was related to the Wall Street explosion, which, as you can remember, which happened just before the Sacco-Vanzetti trial began.
Yes.
And this book, written by, I think, not only a well-known, but supposedly a historian of the left, Mike Davis, wrote this book called Buddha's Wagon, which calls it the first terrorist attack in the United States, the blowing up of the wagon on Wall Street back in 1920. There's another book published by the Yale University Press, which is called The Day Wall Street Blew Up. And then there's the new book, which is about the case itself, called just the Sacco-Vanzetti case by Bruce Watson, which is sort of a summing up of the case. And then they have one that just came out, which is on the Sacco-Vanzetti affair. He tries to show how it turned from a case into an affair, its publicity overseas. The one thing that I get a little amazed at is how little they deal with the anarchism of the two men, except with the idea of violence and terrorism, which is why they call it Buddha's Wagon, without convincing proof, let's say. It's been suggested by some, including Paul Average, who we all know, respect his work, but I'm not quite sure how convincing that argument is to me in this point. But they take Paul's sense of what happened then. And one titles his book called Buddha's Wagon. He calls it the first terrorist attack in the United States. And Beverly Gage, again in her book, deals with Wall Street and more or less goes along. But this is the issue of violence with the anarchist group, particularly the Galliani group. And it's become a problem on how to deal with it because everybody makes the instant connection of terrorism, violence, bombs, anarchists. Do you have to deal with this issue much when you talk about the Sacco Vanzetti case? And how do you deal with it?
Well, I deal with it really by talking about the philosophy of anarchism and the history of anarchism, and by talking about the history of violence and the relationship of anarchism to violence. And when I talk about anarchism, I generally point out that there are two great misconceptions about anarchism. One is that anarchism means chaos. Anarchism means a society without regulation, without order, a society where everybody does whatever he wants, and this is a very common notion of anarchism. The other misconception is about violence, and that is the idea that anarchism involves inevitably violence, and that anarchists are violent. And that's the issue I deal with mostly, because I have no doubt, and I point this out, there have been anarchists who have committed acts of violence. And on the other hand, I would guess that the majority of anarchists have not believed in violence. Anarchism is a very broad term. It covers a whole spectrum of tactics, and violence is at one end of the spectrum, non-violence is at the other end of the spectrum. Tolstoy was a kind of anarchist. He did not believe in violence. And what's, I think, most important is not to isolate the violence of anarchists from the violence of society at large. And after all, if you took all of the acts of violence committed by anarchists in history and placed them against the violence of the state, I mean, the violence of anarchists is a very puny affair. Actually, it's very comparable to the situation today, where there's an enormous hysteria about terrorism. And if you add up all of the instances of individual or group terrorism, suicide bombers, even 9/11, and this is not, of course, to exonerate these acts of terrorism, but it's a matter of proportion. It's a matter of a kind of sensible estimate of what are the really serious problems we have to deal with. If you add up all the acts of terrorism in the current contemporary situation, measure them against the bombings carried out by the United States, by Israel, by other nations, I mean, the ratio is 1,000 or 10,000 to 1. So there's something absurd about singling out the violence of anarchism. And of course, the very fact that some anarchists have committed acts of violence, the very fact that some anarchists have advocated violence, I mean, there's no doubt. If you look at the leaflets put out by the anarchists of Chicago on the eve or right after on the eve of the Haymarket affair and right after the Harvester strike, they are calling for violence. But there's an immediate jump from the fact that anarchists in a situation like that may call for violence, immediate jump from that to assuming that therefore when something happens, like the bomb falling in the midst of the police at the Haymarket Square, well, the anarchists must have committed it. And so what happens? Then the state commits its act of violence. It executes for anarchists without any evidence that they have committed any act of violence. So my whole approach to violence is to put it in perspective in relation to the whole spectrum of approaches that different anarchists have, and put it in perspective in relation to the violence of the larger society.
Well, this is a debate that actually most of the group that Sacco and Vanzetti were part of, this was one of their topics time and time again. And it was interesting the way they dealt with it. First of all, they didn't use the word violence so much as self-defense, and they made a crucial distinction between that. There were some, like, of course, Emile Henry, some of the French were pretty, there are no innocent among the bourgeois and so forth, were pretty strong about this. But this particular group was not. They did not believe in violence for violence sake. But yet, this thing about, since, of course, at the same time, they did publish a bomb manual, which was called La Salute en Voi, which means health is within you. By the way, that was a takeoff on Tolstoy, who said, God is within you. They changed it a bit. And this was a bomb manual. And there is no question that it was used at times, but it's very few times, if this particular group, as far as I can see, never initiated an act of violence. It was much like in 1912 when they had the strike and they found that the ones who planted the dynamite were the owners, not the workers. And of course, the workers had to pay for it. But I mean, I find this issue of self-defense as opposed to violence as a crucial one at times. But somehow this group gets called terrorists.
Well,
and it's even something that Paul has said again and again, which I find unfortunate.
Yeah. Same thing applies to the Black Panthers.
Yeah.
The Black Panthers were willing to use violence in self-defense, and they didn't initiate violence. And Malcolm X, who very often is looked upon, as an advocate of violence, no, he talked about violence as self-defense. And so far as I know, the Panthers never initiated any act of violence. They were the victims of violence. So, no, I do think that is an important distinction, because even people who are very close to being pacifists and oppose violence may accept it as a matter of self-defense.
Well, I think so. But this leads us back to the group itself that Sacco and Vanzetti came out of, and how their history is going. The thing that's always been remarkable to me is how little they actually talk about the anarchist milieu of these two men, how they became anarchists. Neither one of them actually, insofar as I can tell, and I'm pretty sure about this, became anarchists because of Luigi Galliani. Sacco, I think you'll be pleased to know, became an anarchist basically because he took part in theater. He did all of these social dramas. And then, as you say, society comes, they had the strike in Hopedale, which was the real social drama. And that essentially helped him to become an anarchist. Vanzetti is a little tougher to pin down. It was mostly perhaps through the reading. But you will find in all of these books there's no detail about the lives of these two men. Vanzetti became an anarchist in Worcester, which is very curious because at the same time you might have had Judge Thayer, who was a lawyer in Worcester before he became judge, Vanzetti, and actually W.G. Thompson, who also came from Worcester, walking the streets of Worcester at the same time before life would take them along very different directions. But When they become anarchists, then they become, for some reason, they become called Gallianisti, which is one of the phrases that I sort of dislike because it makes them followers, which they never were. They had decided on their own road where to go. And this is the part that's left out of most books. They're interested in the effect. You know, Paul deals with it, Paul Average, in his book, but he calls it the anarchist background. To me, it's more like a foreground of a context. It's the most important part of, I don't know how you feel about that.
Yeah. Well, no, I think the labeling of them as Gallianists and talking about the Galliano group, Gallic group, I think that's an attempt to create the idea of a conspiracy and of something sinister and secret and conspiratorial, and it's simply, you know, another attempt, you might say, of guilt by association. You know, anything then you'd say about Galliani then can be applied to them. You know, I see it as just another way of building up the case against them.
Well, this is one of the more remarkable things I think about the case itself. As I say, it's probably the case that has had more words written about it than any other criminal case in the United States. It's had so many books, so many different points of view. And yet the remarkable thing is not one book has been written that uses most of the important available material. Some of which, of course, are government documents. I mean, for instance, because of the website now, you can go to the FBI website and you will find the Sacco Vanzetti case on site. But of course, they have that wonderful technique, which I'm sure you're aware of, which is called redacting, where they say, "Dear sir, everything is blacked out, sincerely yours." We're trying to get those papers unredacted. But the amazing thing, I think this leads into something that you had said before, was just how much the government was spying, was looking at people, not just the Galliani group, the Chronica Sovversiva group, but any radical. I mean, from Eugene Debs to Carlo Tresca, name your radical. And they had 4, 5, 6, 7 confidential spies, informers, agents, and all of these papers are still in Washington, most of them unlooked at. The one thing that seems to be unlocking some part of Sacco Vanzetti history are two funny aspects. One is genealogy, and one is the interest in local history, and of course emigration history. But somehow the U.S. government has gotten into the most unlikely combination with the Mormons, who, as we all know, are computer demons. They seem to be digitizing many parts of the old government documents for genealogical purposes, but they're putting a lot of these old files online. And it's amazing what they contain. I think they're gonna, America, as you suggested, in practice, freedom in the streets, freedom in the courtroom, freedom in the police station are very different things from the freedom that is expressed in the Constitution and in the laws. But I think we're going to find out what living in America was for a radical, for an immigrant, for a foreigner. I think everything is repeating itself. It's like the wheel has come full turn when we look at what's happening today.
Yeah, it's interesting how the same issues arise today. I mean, you would think that after all of that surrounding the Sacco Vanzetti case, that we would have advanced somehow on the whole issue of our attitude towards immigrants, but we have not. And I mean, today, the treatment of immigrants, in fact, not only is it horrible in human terms, but it's on a much larger scale than what happened at the time of Sacco and Vanzetti.
Well, it's sort of remarkable when, at one time, when people looked at the Sacco-Vanzetti trial, and particularly people in Europe, let us say, but how can this be a trial which has taken 7 years? And now we just have the example of someone who was held for 7 years without even access to a lawyer or to a trial. Like you say, things don't seem to be improving, especially in the way they deal with radical immigrants. Or, well, this is not truly an immigrant, but the way the government is trying to deal with people who are against it. Somehow the laws are applied only very selectively.
What's interesting to me is that the people that the government targets are actually not, in real terms, dangers to the government.
Mm-hmm.
When the government targeted the Communist Party in the McCarthy period, Hoover, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, conjured up images of the communists about to take over the country. Of course, this was absurd. These radical groups have always been small. They have not even come close to changing American society in any drastic way of taking over the government. But to paint them as dangers has been very useful to the government, because to paint a small group of anarchists or socialists or communists as threats to the society is to create a fear throughout the society. And the people who are most significantly oppressed then are not just the people singled out for punishment, whether it's Sacco and Vanzetti or the communist leaders of the Cold War. They are not the main targets, really. The main targets are the general population and the people who might at some point become very conscious of what's wrong with society and might form a social movement that would indeed threaten society. And so the idea of singling out these people is to create a kind of a hysteria which enables a government to crack down and really to control information and to control activities and to control what people do. So these things are very useful, even though the people that they target are in themselves not really threats to the government.
Well, I think coming back to a question that perhaps we opened up with, the particular attraction, the particular appeal of this case, I think, of course, what we have that's rather special, and I think you, because you've written for the stage and the drama, is what is special is actually the language of the two men. I mean, English was not their natural language. Vanzetti essentially learned it in prison. Sacco actually spoke it much better than Vanzetti. He had gone to English classes at night and learned. But when they had to write to all their correspondents for a period of 7 years, they're, I'm sure, the only criminals, would-be criminals, that have a Penguin book still published of their letters. I mean, their language is intensely moving. I mean, Vanzetti has written more, but some of Sacco's are quite beautiful.
Sacco's letters to his son, the eloquence. And of course, there's something special about people who learn English. People who learn English as a second language are not as constrained by the language as
grammar.
That's right. And therefore, their language is more poetic. Their language is more imaginative. I mean, you read the words of Sacco and Vanzetti, and they're amazing in their poetic eloquence. Just reading those letters is a literary feast.
Well, the amazing thing that I found, of course, they deserve the prominence that was given not only to their faith, because they were the ones that paid the price, they were in jail and what have you, but the rest of the group that they were part of had just as many amazing stories that could be told. But as I say, they didn't quite have the dramatic and tragic setting that Sacco and Vanzetti had. But that's, to me, what interests me about the case is the movement itself and how, first of all, it's not a fringe movement, not a movement that's off the spectrum. It's one that survived for almost the full length of the 20th century. Published a paper every single year of its existence, and did some amazing things, both in helping other radical movements throughout the world. I think the big catchphrase right now is transnational. There are no borders. I mean, Gori said it much simpler. He said, I can't remember, how did he say, Nostra patria è tutto il mondo. Our homeland is the whole world. And they lived by that. And it's very funny. Now we're getting to a situation where that's much truer than it was in those days, because all we had was really the ocean liners, and now we have the internet. And I think that's a great example for younger radicals, modern radicals. What do you see of the uses that young radicals could make of the Sacco Vanzetti case, or their existence, or their life?
I think that to keep the case alive, does a number of things. It brings a focus on the whole issue of the system of justice and how it operates, inside all of the prejudices of class and politics and foreign-born and native-born. And so, like any other important historical event, if you look closely at any one historical event, it throws out a sort of a dozen different lights on different aspects of American society. Now, you were talking about the use of the internet and the global nature now of communication, and I do think it's remarkable, considering the primitive communication that existed at that time, that the case of Sacco and Vanzetti became known throughout the world. To me, that's incredible. And today, of course, it becomes possible because of the speed of communication to make cases like this known immediately all over the world. I was in Paris a few years ago, and there I saw posters about Mumia Abu Jamal, Italy, other parts of the world. They know about these cases, and young people around the world know what's happening in other countries because of the internet and all of these new means of communication. The possibilities there, I think, are enormous. After all, on the eve of the war in Iraq in 2003, you may recall, on February 15th, 15 million people around the world on one day protested against the war. How could you do that? How could you organize people all over the world to protest on one day? Only through the fantastic developments in internet communication.
Well, that was one of the most remarkable aspects about the case, just how they got all of much of it was done in the beginning also by this connection between anarchist groups. Somehow later it becomes, they don't get much credit for it anymore. It's Fred Moore who deservedly had a lot to do with it, because he certainly got the support of the labor unions and what have you. But it was an amazing story for that period, and he was the one, in a sense, he was a master of using public relations that created the Sacco Vanzetti case, because they wouldn't have had quite the same publicity. The anarchist groups had good publicity in Europe and France and Italy, but in the United States, I think it was Fred Moore, who of course we know from the Lawrence strike, where he was a lawyer too and knew something about Massachusetts, which wasn't too flattering. But this, I guess, brings up one of the issues today about how do we deal with the issue of innocence or guilt, and how much does it matter in the history of the case?
Well, I have never asserted definitively that, Sacco and Vanzetti were innocent. The truth is, that was not my main concern, and it still is not my main concern. And in fact, I take the same position today with regard to the Rosenberg case. The Rosenberg case is another case where book after article after book after article come out and who, were they guilty, were they innocent, was one of them guilty and the other innocent. And to me, that's not the most important thing. To me, the most important thing is what is the societal context in which this case took place. Because the questions of guilt and innocence will probably never be settled finally. And therefore, it becomes an impenetrable and endless argument, which I think leads into blind alleys and takes you away from what I think are the main issues. And the main issues are not whether they're guilty or innocent, because then that just makes it another murder story, another detective story. No, the important issues are the nature of justice in American society, the nature of society itself, the ideas of the people who are put up on trial and who are accused of crimes, the motives of the government, the effects of the trial on society at large. Those to me are the important things.
But this, of course, is why the Sacco Vanzetti case, of course, above all, is contentious, or because they become symbols or images, icons, and they become sort of like the shuttlecock between the left and the right. To the right, of course, if they can show that Sacco and Vanzetti were guilty, then all of the moral points that you make about the system of justice, the men, their movement, fall, according to this argument, sort of go away. And this is why they're always looking, there are always these new revelations, the one about Upton Sinclair, supposedly speaking with Fred Moore, and how you deal with these. But I think on the whole, I think your approach for the moment, at least, let's say, is right, that it's going to be hard to come up with any answer which will completely convince all of your readers or all of your audience. But at the same time, people just of goodwill toward historical fact. But this, doesn't seem to be the faith of the Sacco Vanzetti case. That's why it has such titles as The Case That Will Not Die, The Never-Ending Wrong. There's something that is continual and unresolvable, it seems, about the case. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. Well, I think that it's so important to keep the case alive and to steer the discussion away from the question of guilt or innocence, because, as I said, it's something that's really unsolvable. And it's like there's so many instances like this, which I think divert us from an examination of society and the relation of ourselves to society. The Kennedy assassination is another such example. I have seen the energy of people on the left, of many, many people on the left, wasted, in my opinion, on a kind of infinite succession of debates and discussions and research on the question of who killed John F. Kennedy. And so I think it's, if we are going to keep the case of Sacco and Vanzetti alive, I think we have to put that whole issue aside. And because whether they were innocent or guilty, the nature of the society that prosecuted them is the most important thing we can focus on. There was no way that their guilt or innocence could be ascertained. Even if they were found guilty today on a basis of evidence, it wouldn't say anything about the fact that at the time, based on the trial, at the trial record and the evidence, there was absolutely no clarity and no certainty at all of their guilt. And what that says is something about the nature of American justice. And that's the important thing.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think there's absolutely no question that any honest assessment of the facts will say on the basis of the legal evidence and so forth that they were tried and convicted unfairly. Most of these other questions, as you probably know, arise from the historical treatment of new evidence, supposedly the ballistics evidence that shows, et cetera, but that had nothing to do with the trial itself. And as a matter of fact, you mentioned what the internet does. It's amazing what that throws up. Do you know that there were actually people selling some ballistics evidence from the Sacco Vanzetti trial? That shows you how misused some of that material is that was in the possession of the state police and so forth. I think those things are beyond solution. You can't come up with a definite answer. The amazing thing to me, of course, as a radical, is how few, even among the radicals, they don't even accept the words of Sacco and Vanzetti, who said we were innocent. Because as you well know, it wouldn't have been, no one would have looked any worse upon them if they said, yes, we did it, and we did it for the cause. But that never occurred to them. I mean, they just unequivocally, that sort of moral proof, which doesn't carry much weight with the historians probably, but I think if you read and try to the type of people that they were and how they lived their lives should carry some weight. That's why perhaps I think it's very operatic in nature. I think sort of the moral and spiritual energy carries over the actual facts and documentation.
I think it's very important that you talk about their character, the kind of people they were. And I think it's very important to take the focus away from those days and weeks of the trial and to ask a question of who were these people?
Yeah.
What were they like? What did they care about? What were their values? To miss that is to have a very, very narrow and distorted focus.
For instance, one of the untold stories of the case is really about Sacco's companion, Rose Sacco. So she was a young girl when she came to the United States. She had been schooled in a convent, and she met Sacco acting in these plays around Milford. They fell in love through theater, and they married. Now, they married not in church, but in those days you just didn't live together. They went to the town hall to get their certificate, you see. But the amazing thing is the saga of Rose Sacco, who came from a religious background, and she became an anarchist much perhaps at the same time as Niccolo Ferdinando, his actual name. And she remained an anarchist all of her life. Some of her children were not anarchists. Some of them were religious, but she would never enter a church because of the strength of her beliefs. And I think that's one of the amazing side stories of the case, the movement, and the types of people, the commitment they made, I think, to their choice and how long the movement lasted. This is one of the great sort of still untold stories of that movement.
You know, the thing about anarchists, and I find this, consistently true, that when you look into the personal lives of these anarchists, these are exemplary people. The discovery of, for instance, of Emma Goldman, it really, I say the discovery because she was so long lost as a figure in American history, and in the 60s, when there was a kind of resurgence of interest in anarchism, she suddenly became read again, and people became interested in her. And you examine her life, and you see this remarkable, selfless person. Or I think of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn.
Yeah.
And
She's a
you examine the character of these people. Amazing.
Well, Sacco and Vanzetti belonged to a very contentious group. You know, they were quite critical of Emma Goldman. Do you know why? She charged admission to her lectures on anarchism. Thank you, Howard. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, well, this was good.
Can't come up with a definite answer. The amazing thing to me, of course, as a radical, is how few, even among the radicals, they don't even accept the words of Sacco and Vanzetti, who said we were innocent. Because as you well know, it wouldn't have been, no one would have looked any worse upon them if they said, yes, we did it, and we did it for the cause. But that never occurred to them. I mean, they just unequivocally, that sort of moral proof, which doesn't carry much weight with historians probably, but I think if you read and try to, the type of people that they were and how they lived their lives,